Story 1.
I'm just a regular mom, you know? My world revolves around my little boy, Jamie. He's 6, full of energy, and the light of my life. But a couple of months ago, he got really sick. The kind of sick that lands you in a children's hospital with words like chronic and uncertain floating around. That's where our story starts, in a place that's supposed to be full of healing and hope. But for a while, it felt like anything but. The hospital was old, the kind with creaky floors and walls so thin you could hear everything from the room next door. Jamie was placed in a room at the end of a long corridor, far from the nurses' station. It was quieter there, they said, better for rest. But from the very first night, things felt off. Jamie started talking about his new friend, Benny. He said Benny visited him at night, talked to him, played with him. At first, I thought it was just his imagination running wild. Being in a hospital can be lonely for a kid, and Jamie always had a creative mind. But then he started telling me things he couldn't possibly know, things about the hospital's history, about children who'd been patients decades ago, about Benny being one of them. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, or maybe Jamie overheard something from the nurses. But deep down, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. It didn't help that strange things kept happening. Jamie's drawings would suddenly have 2 sets of handprints in crayon, not just his. One evening, I decided to stay awake after Jamie fell asleep, just to see if I could catch anything unusual. Hours ticked by with nothing but the sound of Jamie's soft breathing and the distant hum of the hospital. Just as I was about to give up and chalk it all up to an overactive imagination, I saw it. A small ball rolled slowly across the floor from under Jamie's bed to stop at my feet. There was no draft, no logical explanation for how it moved on its own. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the nurses in passing, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she went pale and quickly changed the subject. That reaction only fueled my curiosity. I started asking more questions, gently probing other parents and staff members. Bits and pieces of stories began to emerge. Tales of a little boy who'd passed away in the hospital years ago. A boy who loved to play pranks and make friends with other patients. A boy named Benjamin. I couldn't believe it. It was too surreal, too much like something out of a storybook. But then again, children have a way of seeing the world differently, don't they? They're open to possibilities we adults dismiss too easily. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change in Jamie. Despite his illness, he seemed happier, more at peace. He talked about Benny less and less until he stopped mentioning him altogether. When I asked why, he said simply, Benny had to go home. Not long after that, Jamie started getting better. The doctors were amazed at his recovery, calling it remarkable given his prognosis. We were finally able to leave the hospital behind us, but the experience stayed with me. Do I believe in ghosts? I'm not sure. But I do believe in something beyond our understanding, something that touched our lives in that old hospital room. Whether it was the spirit of a playful boy or just an extraordinary series of coincidences doesn't really matter to me. What matters is that during one of our darkest times, we weren't alone. And somehow, in some way, it helped us heal. So there you have it. A story that might seem unbelievable but happened to us just the same. Hospitals are places of science and medicine. But maybe, just maybe, they're also places where a little bit of magic can happen when you least expect it.
Story 2.
I was admitted to the hospital for a minor surgery on my appendix. It was supposed to be a routine procedure, nothing to worry about. The doctor said I would be out in a couple of days, and then I could resume my normal life. The surgery went well. According to the nurse who checked on me afterwards, she said I was lucky to have caught the appendicitis before it burst. Otherwise, it could have been fatal. She gave me some painkillers and told me to rest. She also said that I would have a roommate soon, as the hospital was quite busy. I didn't mind sharing a room with someone else. I figured it would be nice to have some company and maybe make a new friend. I was bored and lonely, and the hospital was not exactly a fun place to be. I was lying on my bed watching some TV when I heard the door open. I turned my head and saw two men wheeling in a stretcher. On it was a man who looked like he had been in a terrible accident. He was covered in bandages, tubes, and wires. He had a cast on his left arm and leg and a neck brace. His face was swollen and bruised, and one of his eyes was shut. He was unconscious, and I could hear a faint beeping sound from the monitor attached to him. The men lifted him from the stretcher and placed him on the bed next to mine. They adjusted his position and checked his vital signs. Then they left without saying a word to me. I felt a surge of pity and curiosity for the man. Who was he? What had happened to him? How long would he be here? I wanted to talk to him, but he was obviously in no condition to answer. I hoped he would wake up soon, and maybe we could have a conversation. I decided to leave him alone for now and turned back to the TV. I watched some random shows trying to distract myself from the pain and boredom. I also tried to ignore the beeping sound from the monitor, which was annoying and constant. I don't know how long I was watching TV when I noticed something strange. The beeping sound had changed. It was no longer steady and regular, but erratic and fast. I looked at the monitor and saw that the man's heart rate had increased dramatically. It was over 200 beats per minute, and still rising. I felt a surge of panic and concern for the man. Was he having a heart attack? A seizure? Was he dying? I pressed the call button on my bed, hoping to alert the nurse, but nothing happened. The button was broken or disconnected or something. I tried to shout for help, but my voice was weak and hoarse. No one heard me. I looked around the room, hoping to find a phone or a window or anything that could help me. But there was nothing. The room was isolated and silent, except for the beeping sound, which was getting faster and louder. I felt helpless and scared. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave my bed as I was still hooked to an IV and a catheter. I couldn't reach the man, as he was too far away. I couldn't do anything but watch him suffer. I looked at his face, hoping to see some sign of life, but there was none. His eyes were still closed, his mouth was still slack, his expression was still blank. He looked like a corpse, except for the beeping sound, which was now a frantic alarm. I wondered if he was aware of what was happening to him, if he could feel any pain or fear or anything at all. I wondered if he had a family or friends or anyone who cared about him. I wondered if he had a name. I decided to give him a name. I decided to call him John. I don't know why I chose that name, but it seemed fitting. I started to talk to him as if he could hear me. John, can you hear me? John, are you okay? John, please don't die. John, please wake up. John, please. I repeated his name over and over, hoping to reach him somehow, hoping to calm him down, or comfort him, or save him, hoping to do something, anything, to make a difference. But nothing changed. The beeping sound continued louder and faster until it was unbearable, until it was the only thing I could hear, the only thing I could think about, the only thing that mattered. And then it stopped. The monitor went blank. The alarm went silent. The man went still. He was dead. I stared at him, in shock and disbelief. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I couldn't believe that he was gone. I couldn't believe that I had witnessed his death. I felt a wave of grief and guilt wash over me. I felt like I had failed him, like I had let him down, like I had killed him. I started to cry. I cried for him, for myself, for the world. I cried until I had no tears left. I cried until I fell asleep. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the door opening. I saw two men wheeling in a stretcher. On it was a man who looked like he had been in a terrible accident. He was covered in bandages, tubes, and wires. He had a cast on his left arm and leg and a neck brace. His face was swollen and bruised, and one of his eyes was shut. He was unconscious, and I could hear a faint beeping sound from the monitor attached to him. The men lifted him from the stretcher and placed him on the bed next to mine. They adjusted his position and checked his vital signs. Then they left without saying a word to me. I looked at the man and felt a surge of horror and disbelief. It was the same man. It was John.
Story 3.
I'd always been skeptical about plastic surgery.
but after years of saving and months of research, I decided to take the plunge. The clinic I chose came highly recommended, nestled in the heart of the city with an impeccable reputation. The surgeon was known for his expertise and the testimonials were glowing. However, nothing could have prepared me for the bizarre experience that awaited me. My surgery was scheduled early in the morning. The clinic was eerily quiet when I arrived, with only the receptionist present, her smile a bit too wide for the sleepy atmosphere. She led me to the prep room where I changed into the surgical gown. The room was cold, a stark contrast to the warm and welcoming facade of the clinic. The nurse, when she finally arrived, was brisk and professional, barely making eye contact as she went through the pre-op checklist. Her demeanor was off-putting, but I attributed it to the early hour and possibly a long shift. She left abruptly after hooking me up to the IV, and I was left alone with my thoughts. The silence of the room punctuated only by the soft hum of medical equipment. Time seemed to stretch on forever until the surgeon finally came in. He was as charismatic as his online persona suggested, reassuring me with a pat on the shoulder that felt oddly heavy. His confidence was contagious, and any lingering doubts I had dissipated as I was wheeled into the operating room. The anesthesia took effect quickly, and I drifted off into a dreamless sleep. When I woke up, it was to a sensation of floating, my body feeling impossibly light. I assumed it was the residual effect of the anesthesia, until I tried to sit up and realized I couldn't move. Panic set in, but before I could spiral further, a nurse entered the room. She didn't seem surprised by my state, simply adjusting some knobs on the machines beside my bed and telling me it was normal to feel disoriented after surgery. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, more like resignation. She left without another word, leaving me alone once again. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The clinic remained unnervingly silent. No other patients seemed to be around, and the staff was conspicuously absent. My attempts to call out for anyone, were met with silence. It was as if I was trapped in a bubble where sound couldn't escape. Eventually, the surgeon came to check on me. He seemed pleased with the outcome of the surgery, though I hadn't even seen myself yet. His cheerfulness felt forced this time, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He mentioned something about a minor complication during surgery, but brushed it off as nothing to worry about. It wasn't until I was discharged and finally home that things started to make sense, or rather didn't make sense at all. My friend who had come to pick me up from the clinic mentioned how odd it was that we were the only car in the parking lot. She also said that when she asked for directions to my room at the receptionist seemed confused, as if she wasn't expecting any visitors that day. Over the next few days, my recovery went smoothly, but something felt off. My reflection in the mirror seemed strange, not because of the surgery, but because of how I felt looking at it, as if it wasn't really me staring back. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging deeper into the clinic's history. What I found sent chills down my spine. A few years back, there had been an incident where a patient had gone into a coma during surgery due to an anesthesia error. The patient had been left in a state where they were aware but couldn't move or communicate, a condition known as locked-in syndrome. The story hit too close to home, mirroring my own experience of helplessness post-surgery. It explained the odd behavior of the staff, their resigned looks, and perhaps even why the clinic was so quiet that day. They were afraid of another mistake happening. I couldn't prove any connection between my experience and that incident. After all, my surgery had been successful and I had recovered fully. But I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something happened during my time at the clinic. Maybe my skepticism about plastic surgery wasn't unfounded after all.
Story 4.
I'm a nurse, been one for the better part of my career, working the night shift at a small hospital nestled in a quiet town. Hospitals at night have a different vibe, you know? It's quieter, sure, but it's also when the oddballs come out, or so I thought until last winter. It was a typical night, or as typical as it can get in a hospital. We had the usual mix of patients, some recovering from surgeries, others battling illnesses that wouldn't let them sleep. My rounds were going as expected until I reached room 204. That room was different. It was supposed to be empty. We hadn't had a patient in there since Mr. Henderson was discharged 2 days prior. But that night, the light was on. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open, half expecting to find a colleague who had forgotten to turn off the lights. Instead, the room was cold. Colder than the rest of the hospital, and there was a figure lying in the bed. I blinked a few times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Hospitals can do that to you after hours of non-stop work. Approaching cautiously, I realized it was a woman, her features obscured by shadows. She didn't respond when I called out to her, which sent a shiver down my spine, not from fear, but from concern. Was she a patient who had wandered off from another room? But then how did she get into a locked room? I rushed to her side, checking for any ID or clues to her identity. That's when things got even weirder. The bed she was lying in. It was warm, as if it had been occupied for hours. But the rest of the room? Cold as ice. I called for assistance, trying to keep my voice steady. When help arrived, they were as baffled as I was. We managed to wake the woman up, and she was just as confused. She claimed she was visiting someone in the hospital but couldn't remember who or why. Her ID showed she lived in the town over, with no apparent connection to our hospital. We settled her into a proper room for the night, promising to sort everything out in the morning. But when morning came, she was gone. Not discharged by a doctor, not signed out by a nurse, just gone. Her belongings were still there, neatly placed on the chair next to the bed where we'd left her. The disappearance of the woman became a mystery that consumed the hospital staff for days. We checked the security footage, but every camera that should have captured her movements was inexplicably offline during the hours she would have left. It was as if she vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a lingering chill in room 204. The mystery of the woman in room 204 haunted me for days. I couldn't stop thinking about her, wondering who she was and where she went. I checked the hospital records, hoping to find some clue, but there was nothing. No admission, no discharge, no diagnosis. It was as if she never existed. I decided to do some digging on my own. I took her ID and drove to the address on it. It was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. I knocked on the door, hoping to find someone who knew her. A man opened the door, looking surprised to see me. "Hello, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for this woman." I showed him the ID. "Do you know her?" He stared at the ID, then at me, then back at the ID. His face turned pale. "Yes, that's my wife." "Your wife?" I repeated. "Yes, my wife. She died 2 years ago. She had cancer. She spent her last days in this hospital. In room 204. I felt a chill run down my spine. Room 204. The same room where I found the woman. The same room where she disappeared. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping he was mistaken. He nodded, tears in his eyes. He invited me in, showing me pictures of his wife. She was beautiful, smiling, full of life. He told me how they met, how they fell in love, how they got married. He told me how she got sick, how they fought the disease, how they lost the battle. He told me how he missed her, how he grieved for her, how he wished she was still here. He showed me her death certificate, her funeral program, her grave. He showed me everything that proved she was gone. But I couldn't believe it. I had so many questions, but no answers. I thanked the man for his time and left. I drove back to the hospital. It became clear that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. The decision was made to permanently close off room 204. A local priest was brought in to bless the room and the hospital, in hopes of calming whatever unrest lingered. The hospital returned to its usual rhythm, and room 204 became nothing more than a story to tell during the quiet nights. But for me, it served as a reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil of our understanding. The woman's belongings were donated to a local charity, her presence slowly fading from memory but never entirely gone.